After my father died, my stepmother wanted to kick me out of the house, but she didn't know what was written in the will. The day we buried my father, the skies were thick and gray, heavy with rain that seemed to cling to the earth, unwilling to fall. The air felt almost motionless, dense, as though the world itself were holding its breath. I remember staring blankly at the casket, trying to feel something, but everything inside me had frozen over. People around us muttered condolences, faces blurred by tears, words swallowed by the drumming rain. My mother, Sarah, stood stiffly beside me, her hand on my shoulder feeling foreign and distant, as if she were simply fulfilling a duty. Jack wasn't the kind of person people forgot easily. He'd built a reputation in our town, a hard worker, dependable, a little rough around the edges, but always fair. Some people joked that Jack could fix anything, from a broken lawnmower to a broken heart. And when he laughed, the whole room seemed to light up. I clung to those memories, hoping they'd keep me from drowning in the silence that had taken over our home since he'd passed. After the funeral, we returned to the house, but the rooms felt colder, emptier, as if they'd lost their color without him. That house was full of his presence, his tools in the shed, his reading glasses resting by the armchair, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the hallway. I remember slipping into his chair that night, a comfort I'd taken for granted, only to realize that it no longer felt the same. Then came the reading of the will, and everything shifted in a way I didn't expect. I was 15, and the idea of inheritance felt as distant and unreal as a fairy tale. But as the lawyer read out the details, a sense of weight, of responsibility, settled over me. Jack had planned for this in the way he planned for everything, thinking ahead, looking out for me as he always had. He left everything to me, every cent, every scrap of property, including the house. It was all written down, ironclad, with no loophole or vague language that could be twisted. The room was quiet, my mother's face unreadable as she processed the news. Maybe a part of me hoped she'd be relieved, that she'd see this as a gesture of love from Jack, a promise that I'd be secure even with him gone. But there was something in her eyes, a flash of something I couldn't name back then. Anger? Resentment? All I knew was that the warmth and comfort I associated with family suddenly felt like it was slipping away. After the funeral, we returned to the house, but the rooms felt colder, emptier, as if they'd lost their color without him. That house was full of his presence, his tools in the shed, his reading glasses resting by the armchair, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the hallway. I remember slipping into his chair that night, a comfort I'd taken for granted, only to realize that it no longer felt the same. Then came the reading of the will, and everything shifted in a way I didn't expect. I was 15, and the idea of inheritance felt as distant and unreal as a fairy tale. But as the lawyer read out the details, a sense of weight, of responsibility, settled over me. Jack had planned for this in the way he planned for everything, thinking ahead, looking out for me as he always had. He left everything to me, every cent, every scrap of property, including the house. It was all written down, ironclad, with no loophole or vague language that could be twisted. The room was quiet, my mother's face unreadable as she processed the news. Maybe a part of me hoped she'd be relieved, that she'd see this as a gesture of love from Jack, a promise that I'd be secure even with him gone. But there was something in her eyes, a flash of something I couldn't name back then. Anger? Resentment? All I knew was that the warmth and comfort I associated with family suddenly felt like it was slipping away. I felt like I was slowly being erased too, along with all the traces of Jack. Our house, once a place of safety and warmth, was shifting around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Mike moved in fully just 2 months after Jack's funeral, bringing with him not only his own belongings but also his 2 kids, a teenage son, Andrew, and a daughter, Chloe, who was a few years younger than me. Suddenly, the house was filled with voices that didn't belong there, with laughter that felt forced and unfamiliar. They'd invade my father's kitchen, cluttering the counters with new cereal boxes, moving the cups and plates around like it was their own place. I'd come downstairs in the morning, hoping for a moment of quiet, only to find Mike's kids sprawled on the couch, watching TV as if they owned the place. Sarah was doting on them like they were her own. She'd cook breakfast for them, asking if they wanted seconds, if they were comfortable, if they needed anything. I remember watching her hand Chloe a cup of hot chocolate one morning, complete with marshmallows, and feeling a stab of bitterness. She never did that for me. In those small moments, I felt like I was the outsider, like they were the family, and I was just some extra. One afternoon, I tried to talk to Sarah about it, to ask why she was moving Jack's things and why Mike's kids seemed to be settling in so easily. She looked at me with an expression that was part exhaustion, part irritation. "We need to move forward, honey," she said, her voice unnaturally soft. "This is a fresh start for us. Mike and his kids are part of our lives now." Her words stung, but I bit back my anger. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand how she could replace Jack so quickly. Didn't he mean anything to her? Didn't our family mean anything? But all I managed to say was, "I don't want to forget him." Her face softened for a moment, her eyes almost sympathetic. But then she sighed, as if I were too young to understand, as if I was clinging to some childish fantasy. "It's not about forgetting, sweetheart. It's about moving on." But to me, it felt exactly like forgetting. And worse than that, it felt like I was the only one who remembered. I felt like I was slowly being erased, too, along with all the traces of Jack. Our house, once a place of safety and warmth, was shifting around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Mike moved in fully just 2 months after Jack's funeral, bringing with him not only his own belongings, but also his 2 kids, a teenage son, Andrew, and a daughter, Chloe, who was a few years younger than me. Suddenly, the house was filled with voices that didn't belong there, with laughter that felt forced and unfamiliar. They'd invade my father's kitchen, cluttering the counters with new cereal boxes, moving the cups and plates around like it was their own place. I'd come downstairs in the morning, hoping for a moment of quiet, only to find Mike's kids sprawled on the couch, watching TV as if they owned the place. Sarah was doting on them like they were her own. She'd cook breakfast for them, asking if they wanted seconds, if they were comfortable, if they needed anything. I remember watching her hand Chloe a cup of hot chocolate one morning, complete with marshmallows, and feeling a stab of bitterness. She never did that for me. In those small moments, I felt like I was the outsider, like they were the family, and I was just some extra. One afternoon, I tried to talk to Sarah about it, to ask why she was moving Jack's things and why Mike's kids seemed to be settling in so easily. She looked at me with an expression that was part exhaustion, part irritation. "We need to move forward, honey," she said, her voice unnaturally soft. "This is a fresh start for us. Mike and his kids are part of our lives now." Her words stung, but I bit back my anger. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand how she could replace Jack so quickly. Didn't he mean anything to her? Didn't our family mean anything? But all I managed to say was, "I don't want to forget him." Her face softened for a moment, her eyes almost sympathetic. But then she sighed, as if I were too young to understand, as if I was clinging to some childish fantasy. "It's not about forgetting, sweetheart. It's about moving on." But to me, it felt exactly like forgetting. And worse than that, it felt like I was the only one who remembered. The days turned into weeks, and each one seemed to chip away at the life I'd known. My father's presence continued to vanish piece by piece, his belongings replaced, his memory fading in the faces of people who didn't even know him. I kept hoping Sarah would see how much this hurt me, that she'd realize I wasn't ready to move on like she was. But she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe, I began to think bitterly, she didn't care. Then, not long after, I found out about Jack's will. I'd never seen Sarah so animated as the day she learned that everything, every dollar, every piece of property, had been left to me. She was furious but tried to hide it behind a tight, strained smile. Her face was an odd mix of forced cheerfulness and something sharper, something unsettling that she was trying to bury behind her eyes. "It's good for you, of course," she said one evening, smiling over her wine glass. "Jack made sure you'd be set for life. He was always so thoughtful." She took a long sip, and I could see the tension in her jaw as she swallowed. But then, she leaned in, her voice taking on an edge. Honey, maybe you'd like to transfer one of the properties to me? Just for now, to help out. You know, Mike's looking at new business opportunities, and it would be easier for us to manage if things were well in our hands. I almost laughed. The request was so absurd. Did she think I could just sign over property, like handing her a piece of candy? Jack had set everything up so that I couldn't touch the inheritance until I turned 21. Another one of his protective measures, as if he knew things would get messy without him. I can't do that, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The will says I can't make changes until I'm older. Her face fell, and for a split second, her mask slipped. I saw the anger there, raw and sharp, before she caught herself and forced a smile. Of course, sweetheart. I understand. But her tone was clipped, and the warmth was gone from her eyes. From that day on, things between us shifted. The smiles grew colder, and the distance between us felt like it was stretching wider every day. She barely looked at me anymore, but I could feel her frustration simmering beneath the surface, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. After that conversation, it was like Sarah and I were playing a silent game, both aware of the tension, but unwilling to speak it out loud. She'd spend her evenings with Mike and his kids, laughing in the living room, cooking their favorite meals, planning weekend trips without a second thought for me. I'd come downstairs to see them gathered around the table, like a family I was no longer part of, and I'd feel this ache I couldn't shake, like I was invisible in my own home. The weekend trip started not long after. Sarah would tell me, almost casually, that they were heading up to the lake or taking a short road trip to some beach town. She'd ask if I wanted to join, but her words were empty, her tone so dismissive that I knew the invitation wasn't genuine. Besides, every time they went, there'd be some reason why it just wasn't possible for me to go. She'd say things like, "You should spend some time with your grandparents," or "It'll be more relaxing if it's just the four of us." Each excuse was like a subtle reminder that I wasn't truly part of her new world. One Saturday, I watched from the front window as they loaded the car with beach towels, coolers, and bags packed to the brim. Sarah was bustling around, making sure Mike's kids had everything they needed, reminding them to grab their chargers, their favorite snacks. When they finally pulled away, waving out the window with big, excited smiles, the emptiness in the house felt like it could swallow me whole. I stayed behind, spending that weekend at my grandparents' place. They were kind, warm, and did their best to make me feel wanted. My grandmother, bless her heart, even baked cookies just the way I liked them, with extra chocolate chips. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being discarded, like I'd been pushed out of my own family. It was in those quiet moments at my grandparents' house, sitting by the window with nothing but my thoughts, that I began to accept the truth. Sarah wasn't just forgetting Jack. She was choosing to forget me, too, or at least the part of me that came from him. I knew I couldn't say anything, not without making things worse. But that weekend, I promised myself that I'd never let them push me out of my own home, my father's home. It was the one part of Jack I had left, and I wasn't going to give it up without a fight. As the months went by, the tension in the house became unbearable. Mike started acting as if he were the one in charge, like he had some unspoken authority over me. It was subtle at first. He'd make comments here and there about respecting the rules or helping out more around the house. But before long, he was giving me direct orders, telling me to clean up after myself, or lecturing me on contributing to the family. I couldn't believe the nerve. This man, who hadn't even known my father, was now standing in his house, talking to me as if he had a right to tell me what to do. One evening, after a long day of barely exchanging a word with anyone, I sat down in the living room to watch TV. Mike walked in, glanced at me, and raised an eyebrow. "Do you mind?" he said, gesturing to the remote. I was planning to watch the game with Andrew. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. "I was here first," I replied calmly, not looking up. He let out a sigh, exaggerated, like I was a petulant child. "Look, kid, you could stand to be a little more flexible. We're all family here, right? And in a family, we make space for each other." I stared at him, the words catching in my throat. Family? He'd waltzed into my life, taken over my home, pushed out every memory of my father, and had the audacity to call this arrangement family? Anger bubbled up inside me, but I forced myself to swallow it. "This is my father's house," I said quietly, barely above a whisper. He scoffed, crossing his arms. "And Sarah's home too. Don't forget that. Show a little respect. I'm the one holding things together around here, and you could learn a thing or two about pulling your weight." The words were like a slap in the face. My fists clenched at my sides, and I felt this overwhelming urge to shout back, to tell him exactly what I thought of his little speech. But before I could open my mouth, Sarah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at me with that same disappointed expression that seemed to have become permanent. "Enough, both of you," she said, her voice cold. But then she turned to me, her tone softening in that infuriating, condescending way. "You know, honey, Mike is just trying to make things work for all of us. Maybe it's time you started showing him some respect. He's part of our family now." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. It was like she'd erased everything that had come before, every memory of Jack, every bond we'd had, and replaced it with this new version of family, one that didn't have space for me as I was. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The word family echoed in my head over and over. I kept hearing Sarah's voice, the way she'd told me to respect Mike, as if he'd somehow earned a place in our lives, in my father's house. The anger that had simmered inside me for months was finally boiling over. How could she choose him over me? How could she just erase everything Jack had built? The breaking point came one evening after another small but infuriating confrontation with Mike. He'd been going on about setting some ground rules now that he was taking care of things. I finally snapped, telling him flat out that this wasn't his house, that he had no right to be making rules. The words flew out before I could stop myself. All the frustration and bitterness I'd kept bottled up spilling over. "You're not my father," I said, my voice shaking. "And you never will be." The room fell into a thick, tense silence. Mike stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and anger, as if he couldn't believe I dared to say it. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to hit me. His fists were clenched, and his face was flushed red. But instead, he stormed off, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. Minutes later, Sarah found me in the kitchen, her expression grim and unreadable. She didn't waste any time. "This can't go on, you know," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You need to learn to respect Mike. He's here to stay, whether you like it or not." "I don't care," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "This is Dad's house. Not his. Not yours." I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air, but I didn't care. I was tired of pretending, tired of biting my tongue. Sarah's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger breaking through her calm facade. "If you can't live under the same roof as Mike, then maybe you shouldn't be here at all." I froze, her words hitting me like a punch. Are you kicking me out?" Her silence was answer enough. She looked at me, not with remorse or regret, but with a steely resolve that I barely recognized. "It's for your own good," she said softly, as if she were doing me a favor. "Maybe some time apart will help you see things differently." But I knew what she really meant. She was choosing him. And in that moment, any lingering hope that things could go back to the way they were vanished. I felt like I'd just lost my mother, too. The next morning, I packed my things in silence. I barely had much to take. Just a duffel bag of clothes, a few books, and my old sketchbook that I'd filled with memories of Jack. I could hear laughter downstairs as Mike's kids ran around, carefree, blissfully unaware that my world was coming apart just a few feet above them. When I reached the front door, Sarah was waiting, arms folded, her face set in that hardened look she'd been wearing so often lately. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, watching me as if I were a stranger. The finality of it struck me in that moment. This was it. She wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to change her mind or tell me she loved me, that we'd work it out somehow. In her eyes, I was already gone. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice small, not really expecting an answer, but hoping, somewhere deep down, that she'd show a hint of regret. Her expression softened, but only a little. "You can stay with your grandparents for now," she said. "It'll be better for you there." They can give you some perspective, help you cool down. Her words were careful, calculated, and I could tell she'd rehearsed them in her mind. Without another word, I walked out, closing the door behind me. As I left, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see Mike or his kids settling comfortably into a house that wasn't theirs, that was never supposed to be theirs. I kept walking down the familiar streets, the neighborhood feeling somehow different, smaller, emptier than it ever had before. When I arrived at my grandparents' house, they were waiting for me, just as they always had been. My grandmother hugged me tight the moment she saw me, her warmth and comfort breaking through the coldness I'd felt all morning. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She simply welcomed me in, as if nothing needed explaining. They helped me settle into the spare room, their quiet support the only thing keeping me from falling apart. That night, lying in bed, the reality of it hit me like a wave. I wasn't going back to that house. I had no home with Sarah anymore, no family with her and Mike. And while a part of me wanted to hate her, to feel anger and betrayal, all I felt was an overwhelming sadness. The family I'd once known was gone, and I wasn't sure I'd ever get it back. Life with my grandparents was quiet, steady, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm. They didn't push me to talk about what had happened, though they gave me space to open up if I wanted to. In their warm kitchen, over cups of tea and my grandmother's homemade pie, I felt the weight of everything that had happened start to ease, just a little. But even in that warmth, a gnawing resentment lingered. Every day, I couldn't help but think about how easily Sarah had let me go, how quickly she had chosen Mike and his family over me. Part of me wanted to forget, to just focus on school and my life with my grandparents, but I couldn't. It felt like every day was a reminder that I'd lost something irreplaceable. One evening, as my grandfather and I were fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, he finally spoke up. He was a quiet man, not one to offer advice unless asked, but I could tell he'd been waiting for the right moment. "You know, Jack was a good man," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "He would be proud of you, standing your ground like you did. He wanted to make sure you'd have a future. That's why he left everything to you." His words hit me hard, and I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't thought about it that way before. That Jack's will wasn't just about finances. It was his way of protecting me, even after he was gone. I looked down, blinking away the emotion that threatened to surface. "It doesn't feel like much of a future right now," I muttered. My grandfather gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest part of growing up is learning who really has your best interests at heart." But Jack knew what he was doing. He trusted you to make the right choices when the time came. That night, lying in bed, I felt something shift. Jack had left me more than just his assets. He'd left me the strength to stand up for myself, even if it meant standing alone. I realized then that this wasn't just about a house or a will. It was about honoring his legacy, about holding on to the life he'd worked so hard to build, a life he'd wanted to pass down to me. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Sarah or Mike take away what Jack had left for me. That house was part of my future, and I would find a way to make it mine, no matter what it took. The months passed slowly, but I threw myself into school, work, and spending time with my grandparents. The routine was grounding, almost healing, but I never stopped thinking about the house. I'd visit it sometimes, walking by on the way home, staring at the windows, wondering what was happening inside. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of Mike's kids laughing in the yard, or Sarah bringing groceries into the house, looking so comfortable in a place that didn't belong to them. On one of those walks, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Jack's old toolbox, the same one he'd taught me to use, with his initials carved faintly into the side, was lying on the curb, mixed in with a pile of garbage bags and broken furniture. I could barely believe it. That toolbox was a part of him. He'd kept it organized meticulously, every tool in its place. And now it was lying there like trash. Without thinking, I walked up to it, pulling it out of the pile and brushing off the dust. The sight of it filled me with a rush of memories. Jack showing me how to fix a leaky faucet, guiding my hand as I tightened a screw, his patience as he taught me every little detail. I realized, as I held it, that Mike wasn't just replacing Jack's things. He was actively erasing every trace of him from the house, from my life. My hands shook as I carried the toolbox home, anger simmering inside me. When I walked into my grandparents' house, my grandmother noticed immediately. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her eyes soft with concern. I set the toolbox on the table, my voice barely a whisper. "They threw out his things, everything that mattered to him. They're just getting rid of it." Her face grew serious, and she placed a comforting hand on mine. "Some people can't see the value in things that don't belong to them," she said gently. "But remember, Jack left all of this for you. They may try to take it, but it's up to you to hold on to what matters." Her words stayed with me. That night, I felt something harden within me, a resolve that I hadn't felt before. I knew that it was time to take action, to stop watching from the sidelines while everything Jack had left me was dismantled and discarded. He hadn't trusted Sarah with his legacy. He had trusted me, and I wasn't going to let him down. A few weeks later, after discussing it with my grandparents, I decided to take the first concrete step toward reclaiming the house. I knew Sarah and Mike wouldn't just hand it over, especially now that they were so comfortably settled in. But legally, I had the right. Jack had seen to that. The house was in my name, and I was finally ready to act on that. I contacted a lawyer, a friend of my grandfather's who'd helped my family with legal matters in the past. He listened patiently as I explained the situation, his expression growing serious as I told him everything that had happened since Jack's death. When I'd finished, he nodded, a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "You're well within your rights to reclaim the property," he said. "The house was left to you unconditionally, and as the legal owner, you have the authority to decide who stays and who doesn't." Hearing those words gave me a surge of confidence I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd been waiting for some outside validation, for someone to tell me I was right to want the house back. And now that I had it, there was no turning back. That week, with the lawyer's help, I sent Sarah and Mike an official notice, informing them that I intended to reclaim the property. It was formal, almost cold, the kind of document that cut straight to the point. They had a limited time to vacate. As difficult as it was to send that letter, a part of me felt a strange sense of relief. I was finally standing up for myself and for Jack's legacy. The backlash was immediate. Within hours, my phone was flooded with calls and messages from Sarah. At first, her messages were pleading, almost apologetic. She said they needed more time, that this was unfair, that they hadn't had a chance to plan for anything else. But underneath her pleas was a thread of accusation, as though I were the one betraying her by enforcing what was rightfully mine. I ignored the calls for a while, unsure of what to say, until finally she showed up at my grandparents' house. She looked haggard, tired in a way I'd never seen before, as if the weight of everything had finally settled on her. But her face hardened as soon as she saw me. "How could you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "After everything I've done for you, you're really going to throw us out?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "This was Dad's house," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "He left it to me because he wanted me to have a future. I tried to be patient, to let you and Mike have your space, but I can't sit back and watch while you erase him from my life." Her expression shifted from anger to something close to desperation. "We're family," she whispered. "Can't you see that?" I felt a pang in my chest, but I held my ground. If family meant what it should, you wouldn't have chosen Mike over me. You wouldn't have forced me out. This house is all I have left of Dad. I won't let it go. Sarah stared at me, her face a mix of anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't place. Maybe a glimmer of realization that I wasn't going to back down this time. She turned and left without another word, and as the door closed behind her, I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew this battle wasn't over, but I was ready to see it through. A few days later, I took the final step. I changed the locks on the house. It was strange, standing there with a locksmith as he removed the old keys to replace them with new ones. Part of me felt guilty, even nervous, as if I were doing something wrong. But each time I felt doubt creeping in, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Jack had left this house to me, and after everything Sarah and Mike had put me through, I knew I couldn't back down now. When the locksmith finished, I took a deep breath and walked through each room, taking in the quiet, empty spaces that had once felt like home. I noticed all the changes they'd made, the cheap decorations Mike had hung, the mismatched furniture they'd bought. It was no longer the place I'd grown up in, but in a way that only strengthened my resolve to make it mine again. I decided that once I'd remove the last traces of them, I'd renovate the house to honor Jack, to restore the parts of it that felt like him. That evening, I got a message from Sarah. She was furious, calling me selfish and ungrateful, accusing me of betraying her. She told me that I was heartless and that she couldn't believe her own son would turn on her like this. For a moment, her words stung, bringing back memories of the mother I'd once known, the woman who'd been my only family before Mike had entered our lives. But then, I reminded myself of all the times she'd chosen him over me, of all the nights I'd felt like a stranger in my own home, and the hurt began to fade. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the life and the future Jack had wanted for me. I replied calmly, telling her that I'd given her and Mike time to make other arrangements and that I was done being pushed aside. The next day, Sarah showed up at the house along with Mike and his kids. Hoping to force their way back, Sarah, Mike, and his kids stood outside. Shouting and pleading, I found myself gripping the edge of the dining table, feeling every fiber of wood beneath my fingers. I'd spent so many nights around that table with Jack, talking, laughing, and listening to his stories about his own father, about the work he'd put into the house. Jack had taken such pride in this place, his hands leaving their imprint on every corner, every floorboard, every patch of chipped paint. I could almost feel his presence with me, as if he were standing right there, reminding me to stay strong. Mike's voice grew louder, angrier, his fists pounding on the door, each bang reverberating through the walls. I knew they wanted me to open it, to face them, to cave in, but I stayed rooted in place, listening in silence, reminding myself of why I was doing this. I closed my eyes, and Jack's voice echoed in my memory, steady and reassuring. Sometimes, you've got to stand your ground, no matter who's pushing against you. Outside, Sarah's tone shifted from anger to desperation. Please, she pleaded, her voice almost breaking. We're a family. Can't you see that? I need you to understand, this is hurting everyone. You're making us suffer. You're making me suffer. Hearing her say those words, a part of me wanted to respond, to remind her that she'd been the one to push me out, to make me feel like a stranger in my own home. But as much as it stung, I knew saying it wouldn't change anything. She'd made her choices, just like I was making mine. I stayed silent, gripping that table, breathing deeply, feeling my resolve strengthen with every heartbeat. A few moments later, their voices faded, replaced by silence. I watched through the window as they walked back to their car, defeated. Sarah looked back at the house one last time, her face a mixture of anger and sadness. And for a fleeting second, I almost felt a pang of guilt. But then I thought of all the moments she'd ignored my pain, all the times she'd chosen Mike's family over me, and that guilt dissolved. I watched them drive away, and with every inch of distance, the weight on my chest began to lift. The first thing I did was walk through each room, imagining how Jack would want it to look. The old, peeling wallpaper that Sarah had always disliked. Jack had loved it, said it reminded him of the house he grew up in. I decided to keep it, at least in one room, as a tribute to him. His workshop, which Mike had converted into a cluttered storage space, would become a workshop again. I imagined it filled with Jack's tools, with the smell of sawdust and oil, the way it used to be when he'd call me in to help him on a weekend afternoon. As I walked into Jack's old study, the quiet was almost sacred. His desk, once covered in papers and plans, had been cleared by Mike, but in my mind, I could still see him sitting there, his brow furrowed in concentration. I ran my fingers along the empty shelves, remembering the books he used to keep, the odd souvenirs he'd collected from his travels, each one with a story he'd tell me over and over again. I promised myself I'd restore this room first, bring it back to the way it had been, as a tribute to the man who had left me everything he had. A calmness settled over me as I stood in the center of the study, looking out the window at the yard where he'd taught me to throw a baseball, where we'd built that birdhouse that still hung, weathered but unbroken, on the old oak tree. The memories felt closer now, more vivid, like he was with me, as if this was where he'd always intended me to be. By the end of that first evening alone in the house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. For the first time since Jack's death, I felt like I was home. And standing there, surrounded by his memory and his legacy, I knew that this wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming myself, my family's history, and the future Jack had believed I was capable of building. That night, I sat on the floor of the empty living room, looking around at the place I would rebuild piece by piece. I made a promise to Jack, to myself. I would make this house whole again. It would become a place of strength and warmth, just as he had always intended, and I would honor his legacy every day I lived there. And in that promise, I finally found the peace I'd been searching for since the day he died.